Good evening. It's a great honor to be able to introduce Rebbetzin Barbara Radinsky this evening. There is a halachic principle of ishto kegufo, so I'm also going to introduce Rabbi Radinsky, although certainly neither need an introduction from me. I'm going to be incredibly brief. The Radinskys, it's impossible to describe what they did for the Jewish community here in Charleston and what they continue to do. I mean, it's amazing, everything that they created and built and all the relationships they have. And I'm certainly in awe of all of their accomplishments and all that they continue to do. And they serve as role models for young, I like to consider myself a young rabbi still. So again, without taking more time, we are very honored to hear from the Rebbetzin this evening.
Rabbi Davis, thank you very much. I appreciate your kind words, and we're so thrilled that you and Ariella are at the helm of the SBI, and we love all the great things that we continue to hear about you. And I'm so happy that Ariella and I are friends and Facebook friends.
Do you have your machine on?
Do I have my machine on?
Yeah.
Am I working? Am I functioning? Yes, it's working? Okay. No. No, yes.
Pull it up a little bit.
Okay, a lot of quarters, okay. Not so good at this. Okay, is it working?
Yes.
Yes, okay, good evening, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here. It's really, I was very excited about this trip to Charleston, and thank God we've been able to come back several times over the years. And it was really nice to be able to come back here and be able to spend several days here. And we had a wonderful Shabbat in South Windermere. And thank you, everybody, for your hospitality, for your laundry, for your whatever you've done for us while we've been here, and always. So, tonight I'm going to speak about caregiving, and I'm going to speak about my personal experience. It's my personal experience. I'm not suggesting that anybody else should have, or would have, or could have the very same experience that I have. It's everybody's, as I'll talk about, everybody has their own personal family story. This is my story. Some of it is relevant to other people, and some of it just might be interesting for you to hear. So, I will begin. Thou shalt honor your parents. I remember a drasha, a Shabbos sermon, that I heard when I was 12 years old, and that was a lot of years ago. It was 58 years ago, to be exact. And it made a very big impression on my then 12-year-old brain. What's so interesting about that, you might ask? Well, what's amazing to me, first of all, is that speech on a Shabbos morning was given in Yiddish. And I was 12, and I kind of understood it. I was able to get the gist of it, certainly. And it was given by Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik. The Rav, as he's affectionately known to those people who love and adore him and admire him and value everything about him, who died about 20 years ago or so. And my father, by the way, is buried just a few plots next to the Rav. Both my parents are buried right near the Rav and the Rebbetzin. So the Rav's nephew was a year ahead of me in school, and we davened in the same shul, and Rabbi Soloveitchik didn't live in our neighborhood, certainly not in those days. We were already living in Brookline, and he was still back in the old neighborhood. But he came to speak that Shabbos when his nephew's bar mitzvah was. And I remember, since it was Parshas Yisro, which is the parsha that we had this past Shabbat, he was talking about honoring parents. And I remember his saying that visiting parents on Mother's Day and on Father's Day is quite inadequate, and that does not fulfill the mitzvah of honoring parents. Honoring parents must be done on a regular basis. I listened very intently. I was only 12 years old, but already thinking about a very serious matter that would one day impact my life. My mother lived with us for 20 years, as many of you know, from June 1994 until October 24th, 2014, when she passed away in our home with me by her side. Caring for my mother has really been a journey, and with every journey in life, there are twists and turns, sometimes planned and sometimes unplanned. There were some very many plentiful, beautifully sunny Technicolor days, and some cloudy days, and even some very dark days and hours. There were moments of joy and success, and there were sometimes moments of defeat and desperation. In our family, when we take a trip, we always have destination. And those of you who know my husband know that he's very exact, and when he's planning to get someplace, we know exactly where we're gonna go. So we have maps, and we still drive with an atlas, and we have a GPS, and we have OnStar. And for your information, this time we even have old-fashioned AAA triptychs with us, because from here we're driving down to Florida. And we usually stick to our road map, and sometimes they'll say, come on, Deb, let's go that way. And it's, no, we usually do stick to our road map, but occasionally there are detours. My road map for caring for my mother was a little different. We knew what our goal was, but the road map was not set out for us on a Google map or on MapQuest. We created our own directions and our own destiny based on our values, on our personal experiences, and on our family and religious traditions. Every morning in our tefillot, we say the passage from the Talmud, Shabbat 127, that says, these are the precepts whose fruits a person enjoys in this world, but whose principle remains intact for the next world. Those things are honoring one's parents, acts of kindness, early attendance at the house of study, morning and evening hospitality to guests, visiting the sick, providing for a bride, escorting the dead, absorption in prayer, and bringing peace between one person and another person. And the study of Torah is equivalent to all. For me, this prayer hit home. First of all, it's most interesting to me that the first mitzvah recorded here is about honoring one's parents. Clearly, if it's first, it's obviously quite important. As a young child, I saw all of these mitzvot that are listed performed in our family home and also in the homes of our extended family and our community. We frequently had guests in our home. We have friends and people whom we knew, and we often had people whom we didn't know. My parents often hosted college students who needed a good meal and warm hospitality. We were a very large extended family and were the central meeting place of our family since my bubby lived with us. And when the family visited, they always got food. There were the big Shabbat meals and the leftovers on Sunday afternoons, and there were the blintzes and the waffles and ice cream on Sunday night, and maybe some salmon and some crackers and some jam. The food was plentiful. Guests were always with us. My mother cared for families whose young parents had died and the children needed to be supervised and disciplined and fed while one of the other parents went to work. My parents were very actively in our shuls and our schools. And I was in real life very, very enveloped by the precepts that I just mentioned in this passage. The mitzvah of kibbud av v'em, which is the mitzvah of honoring one's parents, is something that my parents were totally involved with. I would suggest that this mitzvah is one of the most challenging mitzvot that any of us could possibly perform. And my parents excelled very, very well in that area with both sets of their parents. Their story of how they took care of my mother's mother is really the beginning of my own caregiving journey. 1933, first day of Rosh Hashanah. My Zaydi Avalo, my mother's father, died. It is 6 weeks then before my parents' wedding. 1933, November 19, my parents were married. They were a very young couple looking forward to creating a new life. My buddy, my mother's mother, moved in with my newlywed parents immediately. Can you imagine that? Young marrieds, a young couple, a whole world ahead of them, and their mother-in-law moves in with them. And it wasn't like my mother was an only child. In fact, she was the next to the youngest of 8 children. Was it a hardship for my parents? Quite frankly, I imagine that it was oftentimes a challenge, but I never, ever, ever heard my father complain about it, and my mother rarely complained. She would mostly say what an honor it was to have Bubby live with them. 1936, my sister was born and often shared a room and even a bed sometimes with our Bubby. 1944, I was born into a nuclear family that included my parents, my sister, and my bubby. When did I become a caregiver, one might ask? The bigger question is, when did I become attached to older people? I can answer that very simply. I loved my bubby like I loved my parents. As a kid, I assumed that it was quite normal to be a 3-generation family. You see, it came with perks for me too. My bubby spent her small amount of money on 2 things. On tzedakah. She gave whatever tzedakah she had. She had very little money. She had so many pushkas lined up in her bedroom drawer. The other thing that she would spend money on was gifts for the family. And she always wanted me to have treats. So every day I could go buy some nash. I would go buy her the Yiddish paper. Started going out when I was about 5, 6 years old, down to the store. And every day I could buy a little bag. I don't think this, well, maybe a few people older than me in this room, but some of you might remember the little bags of Wise potato chips. They were only a nickel in those days. Or I could buy ice cream or a delicious little Drake's Devil Dogs. No wonder I'm still a Nasha. And she would buy me dolls that she would see advertised in the Yiddish paper. My bubby prepared delicious foods for me. So on Friday, she would make a big potato kugel for the family, but for me, she would make these little potato kugelach that would go in those little custard cups that I still have, because it was very important, you can imagine, that we ate well. I've spoken to you about how she davened 3 times a day with such sincerity and how God was her dear friend. I've also told you how she would cry for the matriarchs and the patriarchs. And when she read the story of Joseph, she was reliving not only the biblical stories, but she was living her own personal history. She had lost a couple of children in Europe who were very young. When she came to America, she came in 1921, 1929, she lost a 29-year-old son to appendicitis. And it was days before antibiotics were available. So I became attached to a very religiously devout and very, very loving bubby. And I watched, and I watched. I'm a people watcher still. I love to watch people. Observed, and I observed my parents and how they took care of my bubby. And I also watched how other family members spoke to her. Sometimes I became very disappointed or disapproved of how some of my aunts and uncles related to my bubby. Even though I was a young kid, I noticed. I took it all in. But what do you do or say when you're a little girl? I could not speak up in defense of Bubby. My mother actually did that quite well. I observed and I observed and I observed some more. I was already formulating an unofficial plan for my future. Starting at around age 7, as I mentioned before, I would buy the Yiddish paper and groceries for my bubby. I would buy things like herring wrapped in newspaper, which are definitely from a past era. Who remembers herring wrapped in newspaper? Some of you do, right? Can you imagine nowadays a little 7-year-old kid walking to a store a few blocks away? Well, I did, and we all did. By the time I was 12, 14 years old, I was helping my bubby get in and out of the bathtub. We didn't have a stall shower. I would wash her long blonde hair and help my bubby bathe when my mother or my aunt were not available. As a teen, I did something that might sound a little crazy. I had an uncle who lived far away in California. California seems so far away. When I met my husband, I called my mother and I said, oh, I met this really nice guy, but he's all the way from Seattle, Washington. It was very far away. Now it's not, nothing is far away anymore. So I had this uncle who lived in California, and he would hardly ever write to my bubby. He rarely phoned, and when he did phone, it was usually because he needed money. So my bubby would worry, and she would worry, and she would worry some more. And every day she would say to me in Yiddish, maybe there's a letter from Joe, maybe there's a letter from Joe. So one time I decided that I was going to take things into my own hands, and I was going to fix this situation. You see, Bubby could not read or write English. She could understand a little. We communicated a little. So I wrote a letter pretending that I was my uncle. I placed the letter in an envelope and I stamped it. I proudly brought it up from the mailbox for her. I showed it to her, but she couldn't read it anyway, and I read it to her. And she was quite satisfied for another few weeks, but I did not really feel that it was proper for me to repeat this little trick. I felt that if she was worried, I could be a creative teen to help her out once, but I could not keep this trickery up forever. So I guess it's not surprising, one might say, that I would eventually become my mother's caregiver. One of the Tehillim that we recite on the High Holy Days says, Al tashlichenu la'et zikna, don't throw me out at my old age. Remember Mr. Bill Feldman? Everybody, many people in this room remember Mr. Bill Feldman. May he rest in peace. Used to quote these phrases all the time. I don't think that I really paid too much attention to these phrases until I heard Mr. Feldman say these phrases over and over and over. And I noticed that as he was getting older, he would recite these phrases, not just during davening, but in everyday conversations. And it made a very big impression on me. And though I was a youngster then in my 20s, when I first heard these lines from him, I paid more attention as time progressed and when I davened, and as I started to mature. And the words became more meaningful as I watched many people in our Charleston community age. And I started to internalize those words and felt the words as I interacted with older people on a regular basis. Fast forward to the spring of 1986. My parents were living in the Boston suburbs. My father was having health issues. And my mother decided that my parents were going to move to Charleston. So I found them an apartment in South Windermere. My parents moved to Charleston in the fall of 1986. Moving is quite an adjustment, usually for most people. My father adapted very quickly. It took my mother a little longer to adapt. By 1994, my father's health had deteriorated, and every time he went into the hospital, my mother stayed with us in our home on Montague Street. My mother at that time was 84 years old and had never in her life spent a night alone. She was scared to stay alone in her South Windermere apartment, and we were very protective of her. And that is how our story began. Did my husband and I have long, drawn-out conversations about my mother's future? Not really. Did we agree that she ought to live with us? Yes, absolutely. Did we make a list of pros and cons and dray around and dray around and dray around and keep going back and forth? Nope, not really. We knew there was a need. We felt that we could make it happen and that it was the right thing to do. And just like the Nike commercial says, just do it, my personal life slogan has always been, just do what you have to do. So my father died in July 1994. My mother moved in with us. Tradition. My bubby lived with my parents, with my sister and me. Now my children's bubby would move in with us, with my husband and me, with Chani, who was 9 years old at the time and was our only child still living at home. In 1994, I was working several days a week. My mother was pretty independent. She took the senior bus to the mall and to Marshall's and to doctor appointments. She met her friends. She went to the JCC. She got rides. She was very active. She loved being social. She loved talking to people and telling them her stories. She loved an audience. She watched so much news, and we ordered cable TV for her. She loved talking about politics, and she loved the Democrats. We would have conversations that were occasionally loud and argumentative, with me saying, but Ma, that's not what they meant. Or Ma, how can you even think that, etc., etc., etc. She thought that the sun set on the Kennedys, especially on John F. Kennedy. She loved Bill Clinton, though she did get a little disappointed by his behavior with Monica. Whatever the Democrats did was quite perfect in her mind. My mother's favorite conversations till the end of her life would relate everything back to Boston. For her, the days in Boston were definitely the good old days, and Boston was the hub of her universe. She would ask people, until the end of her life, if they ever heard of Maimonides School. She would ask them if they ever heard of the Rav, of Rabbi Soloveitchik. Then she would tell them stories. And she repeated her stories very, very, very frequently. We always noticed how so many people, family members and friends and acquaintances, were so patient with her. It could be annoying, and it did take lots of patience to listen to the stories over and over. But so many people were so gracious, and I, Barbara Cooper Radinsky, would try to remind myself continually that I needed to stay calm and patient, even though I had heard these stories thousands of times. I did lots of self-talk. I would try to remember all the biblical commandments related to how to treat others, especially the elderly, the needy, and parents. The Torah teaches us, stand before elders. The Torah teaches us not to bear a grudge and not to take revenge. The Torah teaches us so many commandments about interacting with others and being respectful. Give people the benefit of the doubt. Treat others as you want to be treated. So over and over, I would try my best to treat my mother as I would like to be treated. But you know, it's really easier to talk about mitzvot than in actuality to practice them. Day in and day out, I have spent my life listening to stories from all different kinds of people. And I had a chuckle a few minutes ago because I was thinking of the time I called A&T for something. I was on the phone probably for an hour, and I don't know how this happened, but I found out that the person was divorced and she had so much sorrows, and my kids, and I told our kids that story. They were not so surprised, but they just like, somebody's put on WhatsApp the other day something about mom listening to all these stories over and over. So anyway, I do seem to attract people who feel comfortable telling me their stories, and I would patiently give strangers their time, even when it was quite inconvenient for me. So I would tell myself over and over and over, Barbara, listen to your own mother. Oftentimes as a therapist, I have said to clients, you know something, it sounds like it's easier for you to be kinder to people outside of your family than to people in your family. I knew that I did not want to become one of those people who treated people outside of the family more respectfully than I would treat my own mother. So I made a conscious effort. I knew that I had my own personal challenges regarding caregiving. In the earlier years, the challenges were quite different than they were in the later years. How did I manage? I tried to stay focused, and I wanted to be positive. I learned years ago that it was self-preservation to surround oneself as much as possible with positive, supportive people. I have lots of photos of my Bubby, especially in my kitchen where I spend most of my time. Glancing at photos of her was an easy reminder to me of the responsibilities that I faced. And my mother would talk about her own caregiving experiences every day. She would inspire me, and I could open my heart to do a good job, hopefully a superior job as a caregiver. I wanted my mother to live out her years with dignity, with love, and respect. I realized I could take lessons from our tradition. I knew I could learn even from Esau, who was not really such a great guy, yet we know that he treated his father Isaac with so much respect. It is said that whenever Esau came in from the field, he changed his hunting clothes, even though Yitzchak, his father, was blind and couldn't even see his clothes. He also served his father well. He spoke respectfully to him. And he's given credit by our rabbis for honoring and respecting his father. Let me tell you the story of Dama ben Datina, a non-Jew who's an expert in honoring parents. According to a story in the Talmud, this person, Dama, lived in Ashkelon in the 1st century of the Common Era. According to Rabbi Yochanan, when Rabbi Eliezer was asked about the extent of obligation to honor one's parents, he pointed to this non-Jew, Dama, as a perfect example of how to honor parents. The outline of the story is told in the Jerusalem Talmud as follows. It happened one day that one of the precious stones fell out of the high priest's breastplate and was lost. Seeking a replacement, the sages were referred to this certain Dama, who purportedly had the exact jewel that they needed, and he had it in his possession. They offered him 100 dinar, and Dama accepted their offer. When he went to fetch the jewel, he discovered that he could not access it without waking his father. So he returned and informed his clients that he could not provide them with the item that they sought. Assuming that he wanted to renegotiate a higher price, they increased their offer until they reached a sum of 1,000 dinar. When his father finally woke up, he brought them the jewel. They were still willing to pay him 1,000 dinar as a final offer. Dama, however, was only willing to accept the original 100 that he had made the deal with, saying, "What? Do you think I would sell the honor of my fathers for mere coins? I refuse to derive any tangible benefits from the honor of my fathers." And then the Talmud goes on to relate that Dama received a tremendous award for his meritorious behavior. And it said that on that night, his cow gave birth to a pure red heifer, which, if you remember from Bamidbar, from Numbers 19, we need that for attaining ritual purity. So his cow gave birth to that, and then the Jews purchased this very, very rare item for a tremendous amount of money. There's also a story about Dama, how his mother once humiliated him in public, striking him with her shoe while he was sitting in a session as the head of the city council. Out of respect for his mother, he suffered the humiliation in silence, and he even bent down to pick up her shoe, which had fallen from her hand, to return it to her. The Talmud goes on to say that Dama would never sit upon a stone that his father had sat upon, and that even after his father's death, he would continue to treat that stone as an object of reverence. So here we see this non-Jew's reverence and righteousness for his parents, and we certainly can learn from him. By the way, has anybody ever thought about what bracha, what blessing we say for honoring parents? No. Yes?
Days on earth.
Pardon me?
Long days on earth.
Okay, well, not exactly, but we actually don't have a specific blessing that we say for honoring parents, which is interesting because we have so many blessings that we say for so many of the mitzvot. You eat a piece of bread, you say a blessing. Before you eat a piece of fruit, you say a blessing. Put a mezuzah on the door, you see a king, you see a rainbow, so many blessings. Okay, so there is no bracha. And say Ashir Kichanu b'mitzvot tavet tzivanu, that we have been commanded to keep these mitzvot, that God has made us holy, and we're commanded to keep this bracha. So if we were to say that bracha, it would have to be that we were performing a mitzvah specific to the Jewish people. So some rabbis say that honoring parents, as we see from the above stories, is not specific to the Jewish people, and thus we do not say a bracha for that mitzvah. Honor your father and mother is the fifth commandment. It's a very major mitzvah, not, as I said before, not easy to perform. And the rabbis explain this mitzvah in a very general framework. Each person, each family has to figure out how to perform this mitzvah in the most respectful way. There are so many variables to determine how we perform this mitzvah, how we honor our parents. There are so many personal factors. There are psychological factors. There are family experiences and family dynamics that are all part of every person's picture. We worked very hard to make my mother feel as comfortable as possible when she was in our home. She always wanted to contribute her time and effort. She wanted to feel productive, so she cooked and she baked and she polished silverware, she set the table. She did a lot of things to help us around the house. We did try to set boundaries because we wanted to protect her health and her safety. One evening, when I came home from work, as soon as I walked into the house, I could tell that my mother was very, very upset. I guess she was about 85 years old at the time, and for us, you know, that's a kid. For us, so she had been cooking, and a Pyrex dish broke and damaged the linoleum on the floor. Thank you, Zuckers, for them replacing the linoleum. She felt bad that the Pyrex had broken, and she felt horrible about the destroyed linoleum. She told me how she attempted to clean it up, and that's really when I got angry. I didn't care about the damage, but I did care about her bending down and her scrubbing and picking up little pieces of shattered Pyrex glass. I didn't want her to exert herself, so I lost my cool. Honey, our little one, he's not so little now, was about 10 at the time, and she heard my mother and me fussing at each other. And she came into the kitchen and was very sad, and she said to me, "Mommy, Mommy, why are you yelling at Bubby?" In my mind, I quickly transitioned to my own childhood, when I would hear my mother and Bubby argue about the same kind of thing, and I would hate hearing them argue. My mother very, very quickly defended me and answered Honey by saying, Mommy's not mad at me, Mama. Mommy just wants to protect me. Perhaps at that moment, my mother too was remembering how she protected her own mother. I've always felt a tremendous amount of gratitude to my parents. I'm not going to give you the long list now of why. Suffice it to say that I will forever be grateful to them for the constant support and love that they always gave me. In Jewish tradition, parents are considered to be partners with God. And just as we venerate Hashem for his work, we should venerate our parents for being God's messengers, so to speak, for everything that they do for us. The Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, defines the parameters of honoring one's parents and discusses that it's not just what one does for one's parents, but it's how he or she does it that counts. So that the Talmud in Kedushin states that there can be a person who feeds his father pheasant, but because of the way he does it, the son will be taken from this world, and there can be someone who makes his father work at the mill, and nevertheless this action brings him to eternal life. Rabbi Alfred Cohen writes in his recent article in the Journal of Halacha in Contemporary Society that our rabbis evaluated the quality of care that a child gives the parents, not in terms of actual material goods, but rather in terms of attitude. That is, with a pleasant attitude. And sometimes it's a challenge to have a pleasant attitude. How many of you know the story of the man with the wooden bowl? Nobody? Okay, then I'll tell it. There's a story about a wooden bowl that some of you might have heard. It goes something like this. An old man moves in with his son and daughter-in-law and 4-year-old grandson. The old man was in poor health. His eyesight was bad and his hands trembled. When the family sat down to eat together, the grandfather's shaky hands and bad eyesight made eating difficult. Food fell off his spoon, and when he drank from a glass, the milk, the liquid would spill onto the tablecloth. The son and the wife became very, very agitated and irritated. So they said, we must do something about this mess. And what they decided to do was take a little table, put it in the corner, and put the little grandfather there and let him eat alone while the rest of the family enjoyed their dinner. Since he had broken some dishes before, the grandfather now ate from a wooden bowl. When the family looked at the old man, he would sometimes have a tear in his eye as he sat at this little table all by himself. Still, the only time the family would talk to him was when they scolded him for making a mess. The 4-year-old watched and watched and said nothing. One day, the father noticed his little boy playing with wood scraps on the floor. The father asked his son, what are you making? And the boy responded, oh, I'm making a wooden bowl for you and Mama to eat your food in when I grow up. Smiling, the boy went back to playing with the wooden scraps. The parents were quite speechless. They knew what had to be done, and that evening the grandfather sat at the table during dinner for the remainder of his life. He ate with the family. You might want to know some of the challenges that I faced as my mother's caregiver for over 20 years. Where do I begin? I was 50 when my mother moved in with us. I was an active Rebbitzin. I was also working at a paid job as a therapist several days a week. We had only Chani, as I mentioned, at home. She was 9 when my mom moved in. Chani was very, very easy. She still is very easy and very undemanding then as she is now. But she still certainly required attention. We had 4 married children at the time and 2 unmarried children, all living out of town. And we had become grandparents to 3 grandchildren by then, to Ariel and to Sadie and to Rebecca. And I did want to see them occasionally. And I was a wife to a very busy husband who was out at meetings and classes almost every weekday night. I was definitely experiencing the sandwich generation, and I was trying to balance my attention to everyone in my concentric circles. Oftentimes I felt that I needed to take care of my mother physically and emotionally, and figured that the rest of the family could fend for themselves. My husband is probably the one whose needs got pushed aside most frequently, and I would suggest that ideally that should not happen. I do believe that he's always been tolerant and understood me, supported me, he's my champion, and he has forgiven me as well. But this is something that does make me feel sad. The truth is that it's only because of my husband's tolerance that my mother could live with us, just as my father treated my Bubby with so much respect and patience for the 36 years that she lived with my parents. My husband, I have to say, is a tzaddik. He was hospitable and he was caring, and he made it possible for my mother to live with us. I'm the daughter, remember, so it's easy for me, but you know, the son-in-law, the daughter-in-law is the one that it's really the big challenge for. Besides having to balance my time and attention, we also had very little privacy. Usually couples become as empty nesters when the kids go off to college. Can you believe that this is the first time in 48 years that we are empty nesters? Where my husband and I can concentrate solely on each other's needs, and we can more or less come and go as we please. I do miss my mother telling me, even very recently, that I shouldn't walk by myself in the dark, that I should eat properly and dress properly. And it's a little strange now to experience the privacy and my not having to assure her that I'm okay. I really couldn't even be sick over the past 20 years because she would worry about me. When we went out of town on occasion during these past couple of years, my mother was very, very well cared for, obviously, but she would panic, and she even became hostile the past few months. I think she was just very frightened about what would happen to her if I became incapacitated, and I wasn't able to just take it easy because I was on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, no matter where I was in the world. My mother's world started to shrink over the years. Her friends were dying. She was the second youngest of 8 siblings and lost her last sibling about 24 years ago. That's a long time ago. She outlived many nieces and nephews as well, so she would feel sad about the family shrinking. I understood her, but I would sometimes get annoyed and frustrated at her view of family. I was so excited daily about my sisters and my children, about my sisters and my children and grandchildren. My mother was thinking in terms of shrinking, and I was focusing on expansion. I empathized with her loneliness, but I also wanted her to quell over the new generations. She went back and forth, up and down. I think at some point I wised up and I realized that I really cannot control anybody's thoughts and feelings. My life became easier, and I think my mother's became easier as well. Getting older brings very serious financial strains. It's very expensive to live, and it's very expensive to die. When my mother was around 100, we realized that she was having trouble keeping her checkbook straight. By profession, she was a bookkeeper, and she always wanted her checkbook to balance to the penny. My husband helped her a bit with financial management, but she mostly managed on her own. Fortunately, she did not feel like she had to have secrets from us. In my professional dealings with seniors and their families, I discovered years ago that parents who do not share financial and other important information with their children are doing their families a very, very big disservice. So luckily, we knew where all my mother's papers were, and my husband did manage them. About 3 years ago, just 3 years ago now, February, it's February, right? Yes. About 3 years ago now, my mother needed to have paid help. I realized I couldn't leave her alone in the house anymore, and we needed caregiving help. If we had lots more times, I could tell you some of the craziest stories about caregivers, and I'm sure everybody in this room who has had caregivers in their lives can also tell you crazy stories. Ultimately, only by the grace of God, we found a lady named Avis who was our angel. Eventually, my mother did use up all her savings on caregivers, so I went to the Aging Commission, and I tried to get information about accessing TennCare, which is kind of like Medicaid, so that my mother could get some caregiving hours from the state. I learned a tremendous amount as I navigated through the system. I had to become a very, very strong advocate for my mother because now I had to deal with limited state funds, limited personal funds, and with care coordinators who were supposedly advocating for the consumer, but they were also very limited in what they could access and what they could give us in terms of help. On my own, I really had to figure it out, and I could really take a job now in managing something for people and writing letters and helping them, but I'm not. I'm looking to downsize, not to add more jobs. When they gave her 12 hours of care per week, I argued for more, so I got 14 hours, 15 hours of help from 10 care. And when she needed more hours, I wrote letters, I wrote more letters, I begged. I wrote a letter once that I showed to my good friend across the street who's an attorney, and she said, like, Barb, you didn't say anything in the letter. So I went home, that was on a Friday, and after Shabbos, I really wrote a letter. I learned how to write a letter, detailing everything I needed to detail, writing things that I don't even want to talk about, but I had to put down on paper. And I got a few more hours of care for her besides the care that she was paying for with her Social Security check. In December 2013, I proudly accessed 27 hours a week of 10 care for my mother, which took care of some evenings for us, Shabbat, because I really like going to shul, and Sunday mornings. And then Avis, our little angel, continued to be with us for about 30 hours a week until my mother died. And I do speak to her several times a week now. Last May, I kind of gave up on the idea of my mother staying in our home and decided that I would place my mother in the Jewish home in Memphis. I was thinking that I needed some relief because I really was physically and emotionally worn down. And I was so worried about her finances, about our finances, and being able to pay for adequate help. I decided that my mother should be in the Jewish home, and Medicaid would pay for that. They would cover all the expenses, almost all the expenses. I discussed it with my sister. I have one older sister who felt that I needed to do what I needed to do, and she would support whatever I chose to do because I was the one who was really caregiving my mother. I thought that my sister thought that it was a good idea for my mother to go into the Jewish home. My sister, as I said, would support anything I did. I sent an email to all of my mother's grandchildren who were very close to my mother, and I told them that Bubby will be going into the Jewish home in a few minutes. They all said they supported me. The truth is, they were all very upset, but they would not dare to tell me, and they really wanted their Bubby. Not that they wouldn't dare, they appreciated what I was doing, what we were doing, so they weren't going to stand in the way because we were the caregivers. But they really wanted Bubby to remain at home. I made all the arrangements to move her so that I would be able to leave Memphis in a few weeks later to attend our granddaughter's college graduation, to attend a grandchild's son in our grandson's bar mitzvah in New York, and then to take a quick trip to Seattle, like a 2-3 day trip to visit my mother-in-law, who ultimately died 6 weeks later, and it turned out that was my last visit to Seattle to see my mother-in-law. And then I couldn't do it. I think I spoke to some of you on the phone. I couldn't do it. I cried. I was running fever. I was really sick. I was sick physically. I was sick emotionally. I couldn't do it. My husband was in Charleston. Some of you saw him when he came in the spring on that Memphis Jewish tour. I called him up crying and I said, Dove, I can't do it. I'm not putting my mother in the Jewish home. And he, as he always does, like, okay, Barb, whatever you want to do. It's all your fault. So I called all the people that I had made arrangements with, and I canceled out. And I contacted our family for financial assistance. For months, for years, they had been telling me to let them know what we needed. As someone who's always tried to be very independent, I really did not want to ask for help. When I finally did, they came through with flying colors. The moral of the story, and the reason I'm telling it to you, is don't be a martyr. Know that there is support and love somewhere out there. Your support might be different from the kind of support I get, but there's support out there. Access the support. Be creative when you have to be. And by the way, of course, we never told my mother that she had used up all her funds. And she would ask us every day, do I have money in the bank for this? How am I doing? And we would say, Ma, you are so rich. You have so much. Don't worry about it. You're fine. You have plenty. So, yes, there were numerous challenges over the years. It was hard for my mother to become so dependent. It was hard for her to lose almost all her independence. It was hard for her at the end to depend on people to shower her and to dress her. She loved being social, but she couldn't get around so well over these past few years, and her peers were long gone. She wanted to be useful and she wanted to have a purpose. So I'd give her some easy jobs like peeling vegetables and polishing silver, but in truth, how many vegetables do you need to polish in a week? And how many times do you have to give the silver? And my husband would say to me, give her the silver over and over and over. And she didn't know anyway, you know, but so we tried to keep her busy. And she was still even crocheting a few months ago. And last February, she taught me how to crochet. One night I came into her room, and one evening, and she had taught this lovely caregiver how to crochet. So I'm like, well, if you can teach her how to crochet, then it's about time that I learn how to crochet. So between my mother and you two, I learned how to crochet. But her products were getting a little bit more crooked as the days would go by. We had them and we cherished them. Okay, my mother gradually lost her ability to dial the phone and to turn on the TV. I knew that her problems were starting to increase when she was about 101 years old, and she cut the wires from her earphones as she was watching TV one night because she got tangled and couldn't quite figure out how to untangle herself. And then she was really starting to forget who called when and who visited. And then in 2013, when we celebrated Simchas Torah, we had taken her to shul at night, and we came home and she forgot that we had taken her to shul, and she also accused us of not feeding her. And then she would every so often say we never give her anything to eat, and her hearing and her memory was failing. So she also would feel very lonely because she couldn't hear what was going on around her. So when she started to say I didn't give her food, I became very agitated. That was another time that I lost it. And I'm a little embarrassed to admit publicly that my husband came in the door on Simchas Torah and he said, "What is going on here? Where am I? What is all this screaming? Barbara, don't you know your mother doesn't know what she's saying?" So he would keep me grounded. She wasn't screaming, I was. And he would keep me grounded and would remind me constantly that my mother really was not responsible for what she's saying. But you know, it's hard to be criticized, especially when you're trying so hard to do what's right. So there's a story in the Talmud about Ravasi who had an old mother, and his old mother said she wanted jewelry. So he made her some jewelry. Subsequently, the mother said, "I want a husband." Ravasi replied, "I'll look for one for you." And she then said, "I want one as handsome as you." So he then left her and he went to Israel. People are confused about this story and wonder what it's all about. Perhaps Ravasi was thinking that his mother wanted to marry him, and he left. And I'm not going to go into whether it was the right thing or wrong thing, but the point is that was how he solved the problem, because he knew perhaps that he couldn't take good care of her. The Rambam says that when a person's father or mother, Rambam is Maimonides, loses control over the mental faculties, the child should try to conduct his relationship with them according to their new mental condition until God has mercy on them. In other words, until the person dies. If it's impossible for him to remain with a parent because the parent has become so deranged, he should leave the person, depart, and charge others with caring for the parents in an appropriate way. So Jewish tradition does understand the challenges of honoring parents. Sometimes one has to give the care over to others, but still stay involved. One must make sure that the parent is taken care of properly. I, thank God, was able to stay on task and care for my mother. I figured out when we needed more caregivers. Perhaps I should have done it sooner, but I did it eventually. God gave me the opportunity to repay my mother for her and my father's kindnesses, for their infinite love to me and our family. As I said before, there were so many wonderful times of joy. Even last Pesach, we schlepped my mother to New York for Pesach. I surprised my husband one day when I said, "Guess what? I want to go to New York for Pesach." And he said, "Yeah, really?" And I'm like, "Yeah, we're going to go to Pesach. My mother will be the same there as she is here. So let's just go to the kids for Pesach." And we went to Pesach and we schlepped her on the plane. And you know what? My niece and nephew and their kids and our kids have thanked us so many times for bringing her. They thanked me for bringing her to them. So it was certainly worth it. The rabbis have an expression that says love and hate both can cause irrational thinking. When we love someone sometimes so much, we might not be able to think clearly and objectively. I recommend that when you are in a difficult situation, reach out to people whom you trust. Perhaps they can give you a non-distorted, objective view. Find a relative, a friend, a rabbi, a therapist, a psychiatrist. Find someone who can get you on the right track. And I do publicly thank my husband again for always supporting me and taking such extraordinary care of my mother. And I thank my family for always loving me and for loving my mother and for trying to figure out what was best for her and for all of us. I also thank my friends in Charleston and in Memphis, and you all know who you are. You listened and you listened and you listened some more to her stories. You took care of her so that I could go out of town. You visited on Shabbat to keep us company. And I will never, ever forget your acts of kindness to us. And my mother loved each one of you. One of the lessons that I have learned is to appreciate those people who are respectful to older people. And I also did notice those people who are not so respectful to older people. I'm sorry to say that I noticed it. Let's return to our Torah. In the book of Bereshit, when Yaakov returns to Shechem, it says that he returned shalem. Shalem means full or complete. Certainly, he has not been complete until now. How could Yaakov possibly be complete till now? He'd been scared that his family would be destroyed by his brother, so he divided his people into two camps. Then he sent gifts to his brother Esau, giving away lots of his money. Then we see that Yaakov struggled alone with the angel. The angel struck Yaakov in the thigh and hurt him. And after all those tribulations, and it's only after those struggles and tribulations, does Yaakov become a complete person, an Ish Shalem. How can this possibly be? Oftentimes, it's only after one has experienced setbacks that one can feel really more complete and wholesome. One can become stronger and more successful after one meets challenges. I think I have been very blessed. I've had some challenges, but overall, my taking care of my mother has made me feel so blessed and so fulfilled. I feel very, very grateful to Hashem and comfortable that both my husband and I could fulfill this beautiful mitzvah of honoring my parents, and especially my mother. In July 2013, the New York Times reported from Beijing the following story. The Chinese government enacted a law compelling adult children to visit their aging parents. The law was called Protection of the Rights and Interests of Elderly People. And it lays out the duties and the obligations for children to tend to their parents' spiritual needs. Apparently, many aging parents in China and in other industrialized nations complain these days about not seeing their children enough, and the children say that the stresses of daily life, especially in the rapidly expanding cities, prevent them from carving out time for their parents. My bracha, my blessing for all of us sitting in this room this evening is that God will grant us all a very long and healthy life. May He keep us all independent. And if we do require help, I hope that Hashem will help our children and our families wisely figure out what is in our best interest and in their best interest as well. And hopefully the government will not have to get involved to teach future generations about the mitzvah of kibbud av v'em, of honoring parents.
Here, here.